And there we go. Recording has started. Great. So, welcome to Microsoft Security Office Hours. We have our dear friend Sven from the Cloud App Security team, who is going to come in here and talk to us today about MMA, the Azure Management Agent, and using Azure ARC to get logs into the analytics workspace and into Sentinel. Sven, I shall turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Hey, Steve. Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me on the office hours. I appreciate the invite very much, and I'm glad to be talking about this. It's a very timely topic because for those of you who are ingesting data, whether it's operational or security in this context, for this audience, I suppose it's mostly security, of course, that you're interested in, but it could be operational data as well. If you're ingesting that data from your virtual machines into log analytics workspaces in Azure, then you've probably been doing that with the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, aka the Log Analytics Agent. And I want to say about a year ago, maybe a little less than that, we announced that that agent is going to be retired. Now, there's no need for immediate panic in the sense that you still have about 2 years left to continue using fully supported the Microsoft Monitoring Agent on your server and client operating systems. So that's actually through August of 2024 specifically. Now, at the same time, there's never a better time than today to start planning, right, for the retirement of a critical component of your monitoring infrastructure. And so that's what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what the replacement, the replacement for the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, namely the Azure Monitoring Agent, looks like, and how you get that deployed to your on-premises or hybrid infrastructure and make a transition from one to the other. Now, for some of you, actually transitioning a system may never be much of a concern. Maybe you're deploying new systems now and you go straight to the Azure Monitoring Agent, and your older systems that are currently running the MMA might be decommissioned by August of 2024, and so that's absolutely fine. For some of others of you, there might be compelling reasons that you might want to move to the Azure Monitoring Agent before the deadline, right? Before the Microsoft Monitoring Agent is going to be deprecated and discontinued, and thus might be, for example, more efficient log ingestion and things like that. So what I figured I'd start out with is a little bit of a level setting, right, in how these two agents work and how they're different from each other. And then I'll go into a demo as to what it looks like when you have the Azure Monitoring Agent deployed. Again, specifically in this context for security and the Sentinel, and also how you actually get about deploying it and configuring it to send data to your log analytics workspace. Now, if anyone has any questions at any time, I'm monitoring the chat, so please feel free to post us in the chat, and I'll certainly try to end well in advance of the top of the hour, so that we can have some open mic Q&A as well, if you would like to do that. What I currently have on the screen is the kind of the flow, I guess, at a very high level of the current, or actually I shouldn't say current anymore. We've officially now designated the MMA the legacy agent. So the legacy agent. So the legacy agent would be installed on every VM that you wish to monitor. And it doesn't really matter if it's on-prem or in Azure or in another cloud. You're going to have virtual machines, possibly even actually hardware, right? Physical hardware, bare metal. You're going to install the MMA on there, available for both Linux and Windows, of course. And that's really a standalone type of installation. Now, there's, of course, ways to mass deploy that agent, but it doesn't really depend on anything else, and it's completely standalone. And when you deploy that agent, you have to connect that agent to at least one log analytics workspace in Azure before it can start sending data to that particular log analytics workspace. So when you make that configuration, what actually happens is you need to put in, and you may have experienced that, right? You need to put in the workspace ID and a secret key for that workspace. And then the agent will connect to that workspace, will call to get the configuration from the workspace. And the configuration would be essentially telling the agent what data it is supposed to collect and send over to the log analytics workspace. And then, of course, the agent will actually start sending that data. So I've got the arrows, I didn't want to draw arrows from every single VM to every single box. That would have led to a spaghetti diagram. But if it's not already, your opinion might already be that it's too many arrows crossing each other. But so you have the blue lines is where the agent makes the call to get the configuration, and then the green lines is where the agent makes the calls to actually send data. And then again, Sentinel is a solution that runs on top of the log analytics workspace that can then actually use that data to process analytics rules, display workbooks, etc. And so that's a fairly well understood paradigm, right? It's an individual standalone agent deployed everywhere you want to monitor and connect it to the log analytics workspace, gets its configuration, sends data. Very straightforward. But it has some downsides, and I don't want to go too deeply into the downsides, but it has downsides in terms of both performance and as well as flexibility. Okay. So to address some of those areas, there's a brand new agent that's been developed, this time from the ground up. And the reason I'm saying from the ground up is because the Microsoft monitoring agent is essentially the same agent, of course, evolved, but essentially the same as what used to be the operations management agent, right, for Microsoft OMS. So the AMA is been developed from the ground up, and the diagram here looks a little bit more complex than what you saw before, but with some of those additional components that now come into play, you gain a ton of additional flexibility. And the agent itself is also able to process significantly higher number of events per second from a single installation. So there's a lot of benefits, a lot of good news there. So AMA, or the Azure Monitoring Agent, that's the new agent. On a server operating system, so that's Windows Server, Linux servers, you are going to deploy that agent via Azure ARC, which is a completely different Azure technology. Azure ARC is essentially the group name for our hybrid initiatives, hybrid and other cloud initiatives. So the Azure ARC is the prerequisite for using the AMA. And again, I want to stress that's on server operating systems. On client operating systems, we have a slightly different process that's going to be used. It's still going to be a standalone installation on that type of operating system. But so for servers, you're going to first onboard your server operating system with Azure ARC, and that is done through the installation of yet another agent, yet another three-letter acronym, CMA, or Connected Machine Agent. And what that Connected Machine Agent enables you to do is treat those non-Azure virtual machines as if they were managed by Azure. And I shouldn't even say as if they were managed by Azure. As a matter of fact, there are several Azure VM management functions that are enabled by onboarding those non-Azure VMs to Azure ARC. Some of those include inventory, update management. Defender for Cloud is going to go that way as well, and so on. So that is the prerequisite now, is Azure ARC. And then, because that virtual machine that is not running in Azure then appears as if it is running in Azure, we can then use virtual machine extensions, just like we would in the case of VMs that are running in Azure itself. So an extension is essentially a way to send configuration to a virtual machine. And one of those extensions is the Azure Monitoring Agent. And so that is still a separate installation. If you go look at your operating system, you will actually see that there's a process running that essentially corresponds to the Azure Monitoring Agent. But you do not have an MSI file or an exe file in the case of Windows, or a package from a package manager on a Linux anymore, like you did with the MMA. So instead, it's the CMA, that Connected Machine Agent, that monitors the extensions, will upgrade them automatically for you, and do the configuration. So that's the first big difference, really, in the AMA versus the MMA, and that is how it's deployed, right? The requirement to use Azure ARC. And I see Kieran's question in the chat there. That is, does this require a hybrid join for the servers? And when you say hybrid join there, I assume you're talking about Azure Active Directory hybrid joining. And the answer to that is no. It's certainly something you can do, but the answer is no. You do not need to hybrid join your VMs in order to make this work. Now, once you have the AMA installed, and actually, you know, what I've what I've said before about how it gets installed, there's actually a little bit more nuance to that, but again, I'll get to that in the demo. When you have the AMA installed on a VM, the other question then is, well, where does the AMA get its configuration from? And the logical answer would have been, well, from the same place that the MMA got its configuration. But then we hit that same limitation, right? That I could not send all of my security monitoring data to a log analytics workspace, but somehow differentiate between different types of servers, right? Well, other than Linux and Windows, I guess you could always distinguish between Linux and Windows because, of course, they have very different ways of collecting data, syslog versus Windows events. But if I'm talking about Windows servers, let's say, I could choose to include application logs or choose not to include application logs, but I cannot say for this server include application logs and for the other server don't include application logs. And yet that could be very relevant. You know, your domain controllers, your Active Directory domain controllers, those are the keys to the kingdom. And so you probably want to have quite extensive monitoring on them. Maybe the same thing is true for SQL servers, but maybe for certain other types of servers like your file servers, you don't care that much about the application logs. And what that previously meant was you had to make a choice, a tough choice sometimes, as to am I going to collect that data or am I not? You need to make that decision, and it's going to apply to all the servers that are connected to that particular log analytics workspace. So we wanted to get rid of that limitation. And so we've essentially, and when I say we, I mean the collective we at Microsoft actually had nothing to do with that other than talking about it. The team decided that we're going to put essentially a middleman in between the log analytics workspace and the agent. And that is the Azure Monitor Configuration Service. And that's not something that you necessarily have to work with directly. You don't work with that. But what you create are essentially data collection rules. And the data collection rules are the glue between the virtual machine that has the Azure monitoring agent installed and the log analytics workspace where the data is going to end up. And it's that data collection rule that's going to determine what data needs to be collected and where does it go to and from where does it need to be collected. But you have to think about this as a many-to-many relationship. So I can have a single data collection rule apply to multiple VMs, of course, right? Otherwise it wouldn't scale very well. I can also use a single data collection rule to send data to multiple log analytics workspaces. And on top of that, a single VM can be associated with multiple data collection rules, right? So when I say, for those of you with a little bit of a relational database background, there's lots of many-to-many relationships that we're talking about in there where you previously didn't have that option so much. So Kieran has a follow-up question. Would that work with Defender policies through Microsoft Endpoint Manager without hybrid join? That sounds more for a question for either Scott or Steve. I'm thinking about Defender for Endpoint policies, but
yeah.
Steve,
So with Defender for Endpoint, you have the ability of managing them with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. They actually show up inside of there as MDE managed. For those, they need to be Azure domain joined, whether it be hybrid or native Azure AD joined. But yes, Kieran, it does need to be hybrid joined.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that, Steve. I appreciate it. All right, so this is the high-level overview of what has changed conceptually and component-wise between the legacy agent and the Azure monitoring agent. So let's put that into practice. I'm going to focus here on the hybrid story. Okay. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say is certainly going to apply, especially once I start configuring a data collection rule, for example. That's going to apply to Azure VMs just the same. But in order to get started, in an Azure VM, I don't need to do anything anymore, right? That's already part of Azure, right? But on my hybrid or other cloud VMs, that's where I'm going to need to take certain actions. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what my on-premises data center looks like. It's nothing too fancy, right? I just have a laptop with Hyper-V running, and so I've got a couple of virtual machines running here. I have one, and everyone here should feel really special. I have one VM that I created just for this office hours demo, and then a couple of other ones that are just part of my regular demo environment, including a Windows server, Windows 2019 server, SQL 2019 running on Windows 2019, and then I've also got an Ubuntu VM as well. Okay, and this, by the way, the latest machine that I've created, the security office hours demo machine, is actually running Windows Server 2022. Okay, so that's what I have. And so the first thing that I need to do in order to allow these servers data to be collected via the Azure monitoring agent, I need to onboard them to Azure ARC. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So I went one step too far. So here's the Azure ARC overview, specifically the server's overview, but I can take one step back here. This is what Azure ARC looks like in the Azure portal. And Azure ARC is about more than just bringing your VMs from other clouds or on-prem into Azure. It's about much more than that. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to stick with just the infrastructure portion of it, and specifically the server infrastructure portion of it. Okay. I did mention I do have a SQL server, and that's very useful technology that we have in Azure ARC for SQL servers, but again, not directly related to where we need to go with the security office hours demo here. So we'll go ahead and click add here to add a server to Azure ARC. And now I get a choice, right? How do I want to do this? At scale, I'm not going to want to do it one single server at a time. So, we can generate script that'll do multiple servers at a time using a service principal. If those servers have already been onboarded to update management, which is an Azure technology, an Azure feature, then I can actually use Azure Update Management to deploy the ARC agent. And this is very new, actually. I can also use Azure Migrate tooling to onboard servers to Azure ARC using the Migrate tooling. Now, the prerequisite then is that my VMs are running in VMware vSphere at the moment, and I believe this is just at the moment. If you're running on Hyper-V, we don't have that capability quite yet to onboard them that way. Now, for illustration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and go through the process of adding a single server. So I'm going to go ahead and click Generate Script. Now, there's a few questions I have to answer about my server, and specifically, where do I want it to land in Azure before I can get the script created? And so one of the things that I have to answer is, okay, what subscription and what resource group should that VM land in? And it won't be exactly like an Azure VM, but there'll still be a representation of your VM in Azure as an Azure resource. Okay, and so that is what this is asking for. Where is that representation of your VM going to be created, in which resource group? So I've selected that. I'm also going to choose a region. And again, this sounds kind of weird because obviously I'm not actually running my VM in Azure. It stays on-prem or stays in the other cloud, but every resource in Azure has to have a region, and I have to make a choice for that. And then I'm also going to choose, am I generating a package for Windows or am I generating a package for Linux? And then how do I connect to that? Log and Linux workspaces, I can connect to those via private endpoint, or more commonly, I think for most customers, at least in education, via public endpoint. Maybe there's a proxy server in between my endpoints, my VMs, and the public endpoint on the internet. so I could also choose to have proxy server configuration created for me. In my case, I use the public endpoint, so I'll click next. And then I get to add some tags. So these are described as physical location tags, but in reality, they're just Azure tags, right? Whatever you know about tagging in Azure applies to these things. There's just a few predefined names that can be valuable in helping me to organize my Azure ARC resources. So when I have a data center, I live in Mount Juliet, which is near Nashville in Tennessee. So I'll have a Mount Juliet data center. I don't know what the single quotes were there for. Tennessee, USA. So, I could fill this in like that. And then, of course, I can still put in other tags. For example, I always like to put a date created tag on anything that I create. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then when I click next, here's my script. So actually the first step that it reminds me to do, I've already done this, but the first step that you're going to have to do is make sure that the Microsoft.hybrid resource provider is registered for that subscription. Okay, if I haven't done that yet, I can do it here with a relatively simple click. But the actual script is right here, and it's pretty simple. It just makes sure, first of all, that we're going to use TLS 1.2. So Steve, that's just for you out there. Special shout out to you. TLS 1.2 is being used when PowerShell, this is PowerShell script, by the way, that when PowerShell is being used, we're going to use TLS 1.2 to make the outbound call. And then what we're going to do is we're going to download a PowerShell script from this location. Okay, and we're going to put it in temporary folder and give that script this particular name. And then we're going to execute that script. So we're going to execute the install Windows AZCM agent.ps1 script and verify that it didn't come back with some error code on the return value. And then the next thing that needs to happen is actually configure that that agent, that connected machine agent. And so there's a command once that agent is installed. Actually, here's the command line for that agent is azcmagent.exe. There's a connect command. And you can see here, these are all the values that I put in before, right? The resource group and the location and the subscription that I'm going to use, and then all of my tags that I defined earlier. And then for good measure, just check one more time if the exit code of the connect command was successful. And if it was, then we're going to put out a message that says you can go to the Azure portal and see your machine. So I can download that script and run that on a server. I mean, I could technically run this script on as many servers as I wanted to, but this doesn't really scale well. And the reason why this doesn't scale is because you might already be thinking, well, if I run this script, how does this script know, that, I'm authenticated and authorized to, to add machines, right, to Azure ARC in this subscription. And so this script doesn't. And this script, as part of this connect operation, what's going to happen is you're going to be prompted to use the device code login flow. And so that's why that doesn't scale. But the other options that you saw before, some of them use, for example, a service principal that, of course, is scalable. All right. So when you have executed that or installed the agent on your servers, you get a very similar experience for Linux, of course. Okay, then these servers are going to start showing up under the servers area and infrastructure. You can see all 4 of my servers have already been onboarded. I can see the current status, right? They're all currently connected. And, the resource group, the location that I chose, and then you can see here some of these tags that I chose before are just being used to help organize my resources. So that's the first step. Then the next step is now we need to create, or now we need to onboard these servers with the Azure monitoring agent, which, as I mentioned before, is actually an extension to the virtual machine. And this is the same process whether or not you have an ARC VM or a native Azure VM. Though if I go here, I can show you that the extension for my servers has already been deployed. It says right here, Azure Monitor Windows Agent, the version, and the status succeeded. We'll just ignore the fact that I have a couple of extensions that failed to deploy for now. They're not relevant for what we're trying to do here. When I have this monitor agent installed, everything is good. But one thing that is something that I sometimes tend to forget is if you had a virtual machine, an Azure ARC VM, an Azure ARC server that didn't have the Azure Monitor for Windows agent installed yet, okay, then you might be tempted to go ahead and click Add up here, and you're going to say, okay, I want to find the agent, and you're not going to find it. Okay, it's not there, and it's not just there because I already deployed it for this VM. It's just not going to be there, period. And the reason for that is that the way to get the agent, the Azure monitoring agent, deployed to your Azure ARC VM or to your native Azure VM is actually by including it in a data collection rule. Okay. So the way to get the agent deployed is by creating a data collection rule, which I'll demonstrate in just a minute, and assigning that VM to that data collection rule. In other words, to at least one data collection rule, and that'll trigger the installation of that extension. So let's take a look at how we do that. And how we do it for Sentinel, this is important. We actually need to start this process from within Sentinel. Now, I'd set up a Sentinel instance that doesn't have much in it, just for the purposes of this demo. Okay. What you can see is that currently in my list of connected data connectors, I have syslog and the Windows security events via AMA. And so both of these connectors were enabled via the AMA. The syslog connector can't tell the difference whether it came from the AMA or via the older agent, the legacy agent. But both of these are connected this way. Now, on the syslog side, it's essentially the same process that you'll do, but well, I should say essentially the same process, but just a little bit different. But for Windows servers, what we need to do is open the connector page, and when you open the connector page, let this load. You're going to have a configuration tab or configuration heading here. That is where you go to enable data collection rules. Now you can have as many data collection rules as you need to. Okay, so you can go very granular. Okay, or you can just go very generic and create one data collection rule for all of your VMs. That is entirely up to you. But it is important that you go and create this data collection rule for Windows security events from within the Sentinel environment. And I'll show you in a minute why. But first, let's walk through the creation of one of these rules. So the basics is create a rule name. So I'll call just this one office hours demo. And I need to create this rule is essentially another Azure resource. So I need to make sure I put that Azure resource in some kind of resource group. And then I'm going to determine which resources to collect data from. And here is the key to what I mentioned earlier. The Azure Monitor agent will be automatically installed on these machines. Maybe the more technically correct thing would be to say the Azure Monitor extension for, Azure VMs will automatically be enabled. This is the right way to say this. So when I go ahead and add resources, I can absolutely mix, by the way, Azure VMs and Windows, Azure VMs and what am I trying to say? Azure VMs and ARC VMs. So I'll pick one. This is a native Azure virtual machine. And here in my other subscription, I will go ahead and pick an Azure ARC server. Okay, so those are the resources that I'm going to deploy that data collection rule to. And then the next step, I'm going to determine, well, what am I going to collect? And remember, I started this from within Sentinel, and I started this by going to the Windows Security Events connector. So there's really no question that I'm trying to collect Windows security events. But just like in the configuration at the log analytics workspace level, I have to make a choice here. Do I want to collect all security events, a list of common, well-known common security events, a minimal list of security events, or a custom list of security events? And so the common and the minimal, those are the same as with the old agents. There's no difference with the new agent or the old agent. When I go custom, I will create an XPath expression. And those XPath expressions, they can look a little bit cryptic, but you don't have to necessarily learn that by heart. This is essentially the same format that you would find when you go into the event viewer on a Windows box and you enable filtering in Event Viewer, there's a way to actually see this XPath expression showing up in there. So this is just an example where if I was only interested in collecting a single event ID, a single security event ID, 4625 in this case, which would be failed sign-in, then that's what I would. That's how I would do this, and I can create multiple of these expressions. So as many as I need. Well, not as many as I need. There is a limit, but multiple per data collection rule. And then in the end, review and create, I have a chance to review my data collection rule. I'm not actually going to go ahead and create it since I already have one that collects all this data, but that is the way to do it. And like I said, it's very important that you do it from within Sentinel. There's another way to create data collection rules from within Azure Monitor, but what will happen is Sentinel won't recognize this. They won't get added to the security events table in Sentinel, where of course all of your analytics rules are based on. So it's very important that you do it from here. In other words, when you hit refresh, if your rule name, your data collection rule doesn't show up, if it doesn't say here it's created by Sentinel, it's not going to work. It's not going to work as expected to collect Windows security events. Okay. Now, once I've done that, and I've applied, and I have in fact done this, there's a couple of ways in which we can, of course, retrieve that data. The first thing I always like to do is run a heartbeat, right? So I have 4, machines that are connected to this particular log analytics workspace that has the Sentinel solution applied on top of it. And you can see all 4 machines have been reporting. I'm in the central US time zone, so they were reporting as of within about a minute ago. My Linux VM, of course, is going to report via syslog, and so I'll take a quick look here and see when the syslog last reported, and that was about 4 or 5 minutes ago, which isn't that uncommon because I'm actually not using that server for anything, so any kind of activity is very limited. And then on my Windows machines, of course, I will query the security event data just like I would have before, and you can see that some of my servers have significantly more activity than the newest one that I've generated, but in the last 4 hours or so, there have been a couple of thousand events that have been captured using that data collection rule. I'm going to wrap this up. I know we're at time. I'm going to quickly wrap it up by showing you, if you go to Azure Monitor, on the left-hand side in the menu under settings, you can actually see the data collection rules. So those are the data collection rules that have been created. Now I have 4 data collection rules, yes, and only one of them has been created, right, by Sentinel. That's this one right here. And I can tell it from here because when I go to the data sources, it's actually going to tell me here, no standard data sources or destinations found. It's kind of a strange message because you can't actually create an Azure Monitor data collection rule without selecting data sources. So it's not telling me that there are no data sources, it's telling me there are no standard data sources, and that's because it was created via Sentinel. If I look at the other one, you will see that I actually have Windows event logs as a data source, and I actually have selected security events, but that is not going to work for Sentinel. Okay, this rule, this Win security rule, I created via the data collection rules interface by clicking the create button here. That does not work. Okay, that's not going to work for Sentinel. Now, what does work for Sentinel is when I have my Linux machines and I want to collect syslog data, then I'm going to go through the data collection rule creation process here, which is very, very similar as to what I've shown with Sentinel, right? Of course, I'll choose that it's a Linux machine and I'll choose the syslog facilities that I want to include. But other than that, it's a very similar rule, and that data then flows into Azure Monitor logs. You can see here that my destination is that particular Sentinel workspace that I created for this demo. And you can see that my data source here are all the Linux facilities, right? And so I've actually opted not to collect most of them and collect informational level and higher logs for some of the facilities. Okay, so I hope this was a valuable demonstration for you, both on the Azure ARC side as well as on the data collection rule side. And at this point, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I'll be happy to entertain questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Sven. I'm going to stop recording. Sometimes people like to